With Gran Turismo Sport now being a game approaching its 4th anniversary, and with the imminent arrival of GT7 next March, is it still worth buying GT Sport? Now, I did a video reviewing GT Sport in depth on its 3rd anniversary, so if you want to see that video that goes into more detail about every single aspect of the game, check that out. But this one is going to be a more quick discussion, and since we have more information about GT7, it certainly adds another layer to the conversation about whether a new fan, or one that passed up on GT Sport that was perhaps a fan of the older Gran Turismo games, should actually invest in GT Sport. But ultimately, my short answer to that question does remain the same. Yes you should. Now, this more applies to a new fan who may not have played Gran Turismo before, because if you're a fan of the series that didn't like the idea of GT Sport, the fact is you're still not going to like it now. But regardless of which camp you do fall into, unless any of the caveats that I'm going to get into are an absolute deal breaker for you, this is why I would suggest getting the game, starting off with the most important part, the physics and the way it drives, because GT Sport does drive very well. It continues that Gran Turismo trend of striking the balance between being realistic enough and having a different enough feel between all of the cars to be interesting and engaging, without being so difficult and complex that it's going to turn off a new player or a perhaps more casual racing fan. It's certainly easy to improve and get in the groove once you learn how the physics work. Being a Gran Turismo game and a franchise that is so commercially successful, this game had to be playable on a controller, and it certainly is. That's how I've done all my playing, and it is perfectly fine as that. You don't need to invest in any kind of sim rig if that's what you're worried about potentially going into the game. And such concerns certainly were valid with the way GT Sport was presented as a much more heavily esports focused and online competitive game. The career mode, we'll quickly dive into that, is basically an afterthought. It wasn't in the game from launch, but it is now, of course. But the AI are rubbish. It's clear the game wasn't really intended with this in mind, and it's good to make some money. That is its main use for buying cars and investing, but outside of that, you're not really going to get much. There are, of course, the other single player elements like the classic Gran Turismo license tests and the driving missions, which, in my opinion, are a lot more fun, along with the new feature for GT Sports Circuit Experience, which is a very good tool and one I suggest for beginners to start off with when they're progressing through the game. But it's after that stuff is completed that the esports section really becomes key, because if you're not into that side of things, you're not going to have much reason to come back to the game, since it's probably seen its last content update at this point, so there'll be no expanding on the now decently strong 340 car list or the 80 plus circuit variations. Those numbers are pretty healthy and much better than what we had at launch, so that's not too much of a worry going into GT7 6 months away. But of course, if you do intend to dive into the weekly daily races or the bi-weekly time trial competitions, there'll still be entertainment for you, definitely. But now here is where I do warn about the penalty system, which is constantly being evolved, or sometimes devolved I should say, with updates. But it can be too lenient and it can also be too strict depending on the time, really. That's not to say it ruins every single race, but you do have to sometimes work around it and learn what things it will punish for. Even if you wouldn't deem them as your fault or not, you do have to bear it in mind going into the races. But that's not to say there isn't fun to be had, because there definitely is in that competitive esports side of things, and I do think GT Sport is a good way to get into that world. And even for Gran Turismo fans in general who that isn't so much their bag, I would still advise going for GT Sport just to get used to the physics as we go into the more traditional Gran Turismo, that will be 7, because I don't think the physics are going to change all that much, so either way it'll be a good way for players to cut their teeth. But at this time you may not be playing GT Sport for long, but it's a 4-year-old game, as I said, almost, and you can get it for cheap on the PlayStation Store, so there's really not much reason not to get the game. It's certainly not perfect, but at the end of the day, it's still a Gran Turismo game, so it's a racing game executed to a very high standard. And one that I must say has a very active community, which, if you decide to buy GT Sport, may invite a whole new generation of players moving forward for the franchise. So that's my overall thoughts on whether you should buy Gran Turismo Sport now in 2021. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.